Good morning. It's day 20. We are looking at the book of Nehemiah today. We have almost finished the history books of the Old Testament. Let me take you through the book of Nehemiah fairly quickly today because it's not a long one. This story is overlapping with the story we looked at yesterday with Ezra. Nehemiah probably came to Jerusalem about 13 years after Ezra did. So I suppose it's kind of overlapping. It's slightly, it probably just follows on really from the Ezra story. The timing is not entirely clear. We can pin it fairly accurately though, because we've got the names of the kings of Persia whose reigns these things happened in. And so we think that Ezra came to Jerusalem around 458 BCE and Nehemiah about 13 years later. That's probably the best dating that we have. It's not entirely sure. So the book of Nehemiah begins in Susa. Susa is one of the cities of in the Persian Empire. Now I know I sound like I've got shares in the British Museum because I've mentioned it several days recently, and I haven't. Wish I had, but I do love that place. If you go to the British Museum, you can see some artifacts from Susa, from the palace there. Including some, from memory, some beautiful glazed kind of wall tiles and some wonderful like dinner services and things from the palace. The sort of thing that Nehemiah may well have been handling, and also the sort of thing that Esther it is tomorrow, isn't it? May well have been eating from and kind of running her hands along those wall tiles as she was walking around the palace. Can't be sure, of course, but we do know that those date from around that period, from that city. Book of Nehemiah, contains it's largely autobiographical. It's written by Nehemiah and also contains some archive material, as we'll see. Let me run through the story. So it begins in Susa, as I said, and Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king. And one day, some of the people who've been in Jerusalem come back to the citadel of Susa, and he makes it his business to go and find out from them what the news is about Jerusalem and how things are going on. And they say this to him, chapter 1, verse 3. Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. I don't think this is a new event. I think they're saying it hasn't yet been rebuilt. It remains in ruin. The temple has been rebuilt by now, or is well on the way to being rebuilt, but the city itself remains in ruin. And he's really distressed to hear that. So he takes himself off and he grieves before God in prayer, and he fasts and he laments. And the second half of chapter 1, we get a record of his prayer. Now, in the following chapter, we're still in Susa, and he's gone before the king to do his work, and the king notices that he is sort of downcast. And now, whether that's just because the king's quite good at reading body language and Nehemiah's looking a bit glum, or whether it's that Nehemiah is kind of in some way it's clear that he is fasting. Maybe he's wearing something less festal, or maybe he's failed to anoint wash his face or groom himself or something. It's not entirely clear, but the king notices that there's something wrong with Nehemiah and says, "What's up?" And Nehemiah tells him what the reason for his grief is, and following that fairly lengthy prayer in chapter 1, we now get another example of prayer, which is what we sometimes refer to as arrow prayer. He's standing before the king, he kind of shoots this arrow prayer up to God, and then he answers the king immediately. And he asks the king, and there's no clue, I don't think, that he has planned to do this. It feels like one of those moments that present themselves, and he takes the initiative immediately. He says, "Please, will you send me to Jerusalem?" And the king says, "How long will it take you?" And he says that, and then he says, "And please, can you give me letters of safe passage?" So that other people will not only give me safe passage, but support the rebuilding of the walls. And the king agrees to that. And so off he sets. However, we now get the beginnings of some opposition. There are two characters who I think are probably not acting entirely in their own names, but are representatives of others as well, I guess. Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. And these are people in Jerusalem or round about Jerusalem. And they are not at all pleased to see Nehemiah coming with a number of other people with him and this determination to rebuild the walls. We just get the first glimmer of trouble at this point. Nehemiah goes, he rallies the people, he inspects the walls, he checks out the situation, and he talks to the people, and he says, "Come on, chaps, we're going to rebuild this." And he kind of he's a natural leader, actually, and people follow him. So they say, "Okay." Chapter 3, we get a lovely record, and I really love this, actually. It describes which families and which guilds rebuilt which part of the wall, and the whole of Jerusalem's wall is kind of mapped out for us, telling us who did which bit. If you go to I don't know, Bristol Zoo, or one of these kind of public places, there are people or concert halls, sometimes you see this, where you can find walls where people have sponsored a brick or sponsored a seat or sponsored an animal, and there's a kind of often some sort of monument that says who sponsored it. I think it's a bit like that. Here we find out who built which bits of the city, which is, I think, rather lovely. Have you forgotten about Sanballat and Tobiah, though? I hope not, because chapter 4, they're going to cause more trouble. It begins with ridicule. Verse 2. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore the wall? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble? If even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stone. So it begins with ridicule, but it quickly becomes quite threatening. And by verse 8, they are plotting together to come and fight against Jerusalem. And as a result, Nehemiah has to take some quite stringent measures to protect themselves as they get on with the rebuilding project. So verse 16, "From that day on, half of my men did the work of building, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armour, and they posted themselves around to protect the people. But moreover, those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked." So they were really on a high state of alertness, I think is what they would say. They moved to DEFCON 1 as they built, because they were expecting imminent trouble. Now, chapter 5, Nehemiah gets a number of issues that he needs to deal with as the governor of the area, which is, I didn't kind of mention that explicitly, but that he's been sent back to be governor of the area. So first of all, there are a number of people who who are destitute, and some of the other Jews within the community had lent them money at interest, which Nehemiah takes a very dim view of, and actually makes them return the things that have been borrowed, that have been kind of confiscated, really. Verse 11, "Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the usury you are charging them." 1% by the looks of it, which we might regard as quite modest, but it was forbidden in the law. In the second half of that chapter, he goes out of his way to say that although as a governor he's entitled to tax the people in order to provide for his own table, and this is enshrined in the letters of authorization which he brought with him, that he waives that entitlement because he considers that harsh on people who are already poor. Good leadership, I think. Chapter 6, there is more opposition. They've tried mockery, they've tried armed threat, and now they make an accusation of treason. And they say that, Nehemiah, you're going to set yourself up as king in Judah. The kind of implication is we're going to report this back to the emperor. You're going to be in trouble. Treason isn't never well regarded, but in these days of absolute emperors, it would be a pretty swift end to Nehemiah's work and his life, I think. But nonetheless, they press on and they finish the wall in chapter 6. Chapter 7, we get a list of the people who returned with Nehemiah. Remember what I said about the list of returnees that we get in Ezra? Something similar here, a lovely record of names and numbers of people who came back. In chapter 8, there's a great assembly of the people. Now listen to this. Just imagine this. If you go to church on a Sunday morning, just imagine if it was like this. So they're outside for a start, All the people gathered, men, women, and all who can understand. So children old enough to be able to understand what was going on were part of the congregation. And they begin early in the morning and they continue until midday. So it sounds like probably about 6 hours, maybe 5 or 6 hours. And of course, midday heat in the Middle East. No small thing to be standing under the midday heat. And this great congregation is standing there all this time. And a special platform has been built. And on the platform is Ezra and the priests. And Ezra, where are we? He reads the book of the law from daybreak until noon. So imagine in church on Sunday, you stand there in the midday sun from 6 a.m, say, until midday, and the minister stands up and reads Leviticus to you. How would you like that? That's pretty much what's going on here. So they read the law. They regarded this was a great festival for them. The people were a bit grieved and inclined to be sad because they were hearing the law and realizing how much they'd been fallen short. But they are urged to celebrate. This is a holy day. This is a feast. Don't grieve. Celebrate. And so they have a great big feast. They then celebrate the tabernacles again. Do you remember we spoke about that before? They go and get themselves branches and things, and they build little huts for themselves, booths for themselves to live in. They live in it for 7 days. Oh, and they come back and they read more of the law to them every day for the next 7 days. So just imagine that. So that takes place in chapter 8. In chapter 9, there is another great assembly, and this is one that is of lament and repentance. And I just want to come back to that in a little more detail in a moment. So we'll move on for now to finish the overview. At the end of chapter 9, they make a covenant. They make an agreement with God, or they ratify the existing covenant, really. But they sign a document. So chapter 10 is a list of those who sign that document. Chapter 11, they have to now decide, now that these city walls have been rebuilt, they've got to decide who's going to live there. Not everybody who's been rebuilding can live in that city. It's not very big. So they draw lots, and 1 in 10 of the people are allowed to go and live in the holy city. And so they draw lots in order to determine who those people will be. In chapter 12, we get another list, a list of the names of the priests and the Levites. And then we get another great celebration, another great assembly of the people, a dedication of the walls of the city. A wonderful description of what happens. He creates this great choir out of the whole people. Well, not sure it's out of the whole people actually, but a whole load of singers, loads and loads of them. And it's 2 great choirs, and they basically work their way around the city. Now I'm trying to work out, because this wasn't a huge place, and were they singing different things or the same things? I'm not sure it's very clear. But these 2 choirs kind of make their way around the city singing. And then eventually they come down off the wall, they're on the walls, and they come down off the wall into the temple. And there's this great festival in the temple, and loads of sacrifices and prayers and worship, and it's a wonderful day. Chapter 13 are Nehemiah's final reforms, and the 3 things that he wants to tighten up on. I would suggest that you have a look at this if you were disturbed by Ezra yesterday. Compare Ezra with Nehemiah. Because I think I think that Nehemiah is considerably more. He's passionate about the same things as Ezra, but I think he's a little more moderate in the way he conducts himself, except for one moment, which is a bit weird. Perhaps I'll show you that in a moment. So 3 things that he's dealing with. One is that he's excluding all foreigners, because he reads in the law that peoples of certain nations are not ever to be permitted to enter and be part of the community. Now, interestingly, that is a law that has been observed by its breach a number of times, and Ruth is a good example of that, because Ruth was a Moabite. And Moabites were not supposed to enter the assembly of the Lord, and yet Ruth the Moabite comes right into the heart of the nation and becomes part of the genealogy of King David, as we know. So Nehemiah's looking back at the law and not noticing that it's being broken by divine sanction. Nonetheless, so that's the first thing that happens, is foreigners are excluded. The second thing is that he tightens up on observance of the Sabbath. And a whole load of traders were coming into the city to sell their wares on the Sabbath, and he's very cross about this, and he has the gates shut so the traders can't come in. And for 2 consecutive Sabbaths they arrived ready to sell their stuff and they can't get in, and they're very indignant about it. But by the 3rd week they've got the message and they stay away. And then the third one is again about exogamous marriage. We talked about that with Ezra and people who'd married outside the nation. And Nehemiah is also very disturbed by this. Let me just read you this moment, which I hope is kind of slightly metaphorical. If I can find the verse a second. Sorry, 1 second. No, I can't find it. It's there somewhere towards the end of chapter 13. Sorry, but basically he tears out he attacks them. He kind of goes into a bit of a frenzy and pulls out their beards and beats them a bit, and he rebukes them. He rebukes those who have married outside the nation, but there is no description of sending the wives away. So it is worth comparing his actions with the actions of Ezra, although we do remember that Ezra is still alive and operative in these days. So I think there's some overlap and some ambiguity here. Let me just finish off by just asking you to have another look at chapter 9, the second of these great assemblies. So the big festival of sort of joy and booths and celebration and so on was days 1 to 8 of the 7th month. But by the 24th day of the same month, they are now gathering for a solemn festival, a fast. And essentially, the Levites lead the people in a solemn prayer of confession. And it is really, if you want to read part of Nehemiah, read this prayer and this chapter, because it is really wonderful. It appeals to, it retells the story of Israel, the highlights of the story. It talks about creation, the call of Abraham, the Exodus, the covenant. It appeals to the language of Sinai. It appeals to language around the Abrahamic covenant, when God makes a promise to Abraham of his descendants being like the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. We see that language. The self-revelation of God. Remember that time when on Mount Sinai, God revealed himself to Moses and described himself as the Lord, the compassionate, the gracious God. This language comes through as well. So it's a wonderful prayer of repentance that looks back at the good things God has done, appeals to his character of forgiveness, his mercy, remembers the covenant, and leads the people in this corporate act of confession. And then at the end, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they make a covenant in writing. They write a document saying, we will keep the law, we bind ourselves again to being God's faithful people, and they sign the covenant. Now, here's a quiz. And I'd like to invite you to have a look at chapter 9. If you want to, of course you don't have to. Have a look at chapter 9 and see how many places in that prayer you can see the echoes of the story that we have been looking at over the last few weeks. I've given you some hints already, but jot those down. Do you hear language being echoed? Do you see stories being told? But look for those echoes of language as well as the stories that are related. And jot those down, and I'd love it if you'd send them to me. See what you can spot. So you can easily find me to contact me. I'm on Facebook. If you just stick my name into Facebook, I think you'll find me. On Twitter as well, same. You can email me. I'll tell you my email address if you prefer. It's Paynter H, all one word, Paynterh, Paynter H at Bristol-Baptist .ac.uk. So contact me, Facebook, Twitter, or email me, and show me what you find. I'd love it. I'd love to hear back from you, and that'd be a bit of fun. Good. Thanks for that. I will see you tomorrow. We'll do Esther.